What would you do if the family of the person you loved looked you dead in the eye and told you that you weren't good enough? And 3 weeks later, you walked into a boardroom as their father's new boss. I never wanted anyone to know what I was worth. Not because I was ashamed of it, but because I wanted to know if the people around me could see me before they saw my bank account. That one decision led me straight into one of the most humiliating nights of my life, and then, without me lifting a finger for revenge, karma did something I could never have scripted myself. Before we get into it, if stories like this keep you up at night wondering how it ends, hit subscribe to Karma Chronicles. Every subscription tells us to keep telling these stories, and it genuinely keeps us going. Now, let's get into it. My name is Julian Carter. I'm a black man from the south side of Chicago, raised by a single mother who cleaned office buildings downtown at 4 in the morning so I could have new shoes for the school year. I watched her work herself past exhaustion, carrying our whole household on her back without ever once complaining about it in front of me. And I promised myself that one day I would build something that would let her rest. By the time I was 34, that promise had turned into a company most people had never heard of by name, but had used the products of without ever realizing it. I owned a controlling stake in 3 companies across logistics, technology, and manufacturing. On paper, I was worth billions. In person, I still drove myself to the grocery store and wore the same 3 pairs of sneakers I'd had for years. I met Grace Sutton at a charity fundraiser I'd quietly sponsored. She had no idea I was the one who funded the event. We talked for hours about nothing important, and that was exactly what I loved about it. For the first time in years, someone was interested in me, not my name on a building. We dated for a year before she asked me to meet her parents. I told her I would come exactly as I was. Grace's family lived in a large house in the northern suburbs of Chicago, the kind of neighborhood with manicured lawns and driveways full of luxury cars. I arrived in a taxi, wearing a plain button-down shirt and jeans. Her father, Richard Sutton, opened the door and looked me over before he even said hello. Richard was a white man in his early 60s, a regional director at a logistics company, the kind of man who measured worth in watches and windshields and made no effort to hide it. His first question wasn't about my name. It was, "So, what do you drive?" I told him the truth. I'd taken a cab. He let out a short laugh, the kind meant to be heard by everyone in the room. Grace's mother, a woman named Diane, leaned toward her sister at the table and whispered just loud enough for me to catch it. Something about how their daughter deserved a man with real prospects, not a struggling nobody. Grace's 2 older brothers took their turns next. They asked about my watch, a plain one I'd had since college, and laughed when I said I didn't remember the brand. They asked what I did for work, and when I gave a vague answer about running a small logistics consulting practice, one of them muttered that it sounded like a nice way of saying unemployed. By dessert, Richard was openly telling Grace, in front of me, that she was young enough to still change her mind about the engagement. I want to be honest with you. In that moment, every part of me wanted to correct them. I wanted to tell Richard exactly how many people worked for me, exactly what my portfolio looked like, exactly how many logistics regional directors reported up through companies I owned a piece of. I didn't say a word about any of it. Instead, I quietly paid for the entire dinner before anyone noticed the check had come, thanked Diane for the meal, and shook Richard's hand. I told Grace I would call her the next day. Then I walked out to wait for my ride, alone, in the cold. I wasn't performing humility. I genuinely wanted to know if this family could ever respect someone they believed had nothing. The answer that night was clear, and it hurt more than I expected it to, because it wasn't really about me. It was about how easily people decide someone's value before they've heard a single true thing about them. A week later, my head of acquisitions called me with an update on a deal we'd been working on for months. My company was finalizing the purchase of a mid-sized logistics firm based just outside Chicago, a company that handled regional freight distribution across the Midwest. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that one of the firm's regional directors would be in the final meeting to walk us through operations. He said the man's name was Richard Sutton. I sat with that for a long moment. I hadn't chased this. Our team had been evaluating this acquisition long before I ever sat at that dinner table. Life simply arranged for these 2 threads to cross at exactly the wrong time for the people who had underestimated me. I could have pulled myself from the meeting, Part of me considered it. But I decided I owed it to myself and to my mother who scrubbed floors so I could stand in rooms like that one to show up. The morning of the meeting, I walked into the glass-walled conference room in my usual quiet way. No entourage, no announcement. My general counsel and finance lead walked in beside me. Richard was already seated at the far end of the table, going over a folder of operational reports. He looked up when the room went silent. One by one, his colleagues rose slightly from their seats. An executive from my team said, simply, "Everyone, this is Mr. Carter, our majority owner. He'll be leading today's session." I watched the color drain from Richard's face in real time. He looked at me the way you look at someone you're certain you've never met, and then the recognition hit him. The taxi, the plain shirt, the dinner table. The room he had once used to make me feel small was now a room where every person at that table, including him, worked for a company I owned. I didn't say anything about the dinner. I didn't need to. I ran the meeting the same way I run every meeting, asking direct questions about operations, listening carefully to the answers, and making sure every employee in that building understood their jobs were secure through the transition. Richard answered every question I asked with a shaking voice. At one point, he called me Mr. Chairman without being prompted to. It wasn't performance on my part. I wasn't trying to make him uncomfortable. I was simply doing my job, the same job I had quietly been doing for years, the one he assumed didn't exist because I showed up in a taxi. By the end of the meeting, the acquisition was finalized. Every employee, including Richard, kept their position. I made that decision before I ever sat down at that table, because punishing people for their jobs was never the point. The point had already been made the moment he looked across that table and understood who I actually was. Grace found out through her father, not through me. She called me that night, her voice shaking. She told me she had no idea her family would treat me the way they did, and she was ashamed she hadn't spoken up at the table that night. I told her the truth. I wasn't angry at her. I was disappointed that people who loved her could look at another human being, decide he had nothing to offer, and treat him accordingly, all before they'd asked him a single real question about his life. Grace apologized, not just for that night, but for staying quiet in the months after when her family kept making comments about my prospects. She admitted she had let it slide because she didn't want conflict with her parents. That honesty meant more to me than any apology from Richard ever could have. I didn't buy that company to teach anyone a lesson. I didn't orchestrate any of it. What happened was simply the collision of a decision I made months earlier and a choice Richard Sutton made the night he decided a man in a taxi wasn't worth his respect. The lesson I took from all of it wasn't about revenge. It was about paying attention to how people treat those they believe have nothing to offer them. That's when you see who someone really is. Not when they're trying to impress you, but when they think there's nothing to gain. My mother taught me that a long time ago, scrubbing floors in buildings she'd never be invited to sit in as a guest. She used to tell me that people will show you their character for free if you're patient enough to just watch and wait. I just finally understood what she meant, fully, the night I sat at that dinner table and let people underestimate me completely, without correcting a single one of them. Grace and I are still together. Her relationship with her father is still working itself out, and I've told her more than once that I never wanted to be the reason for that distance. Richard still works at the company, and I've never brought up that dinner again. Some things don't need to be said twice. What I hope you take from this isn't the reveal, or the boardroom, or the moment his face went pale. I hope you take the part before all of that, the part where a person can be humiliated at a dinner table and still choose to pay the bill, shake the hand, and walk out with his head up. That's the part of the story that actually matters. If the story meant something to you, subscribe to Karma Chronicles. Every subscriber tells us these stories are worth telling, and it genuinely motivates us to keep bringing you the best of them. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next one.